Whenever you are.
All right. So call to order the meeting of the Manchester Essex School Committee on November 19th at 6:04 p.m. And then to kick things off, we don't have anyone in person, so if there's any public comment online, please type into the chat your name and address.
I don't see anything, and the solicitation has been up since 6.
All right, great. So moving on, I have a really brief share report tonight. I just wanted to actually, and this has to do with the student committee. One, just to cover off on a question that came up at our last meeting about school committee representation at those meetings. So Erica had reached out and mentioned that she'd be interested in taking on that role.
Sure.
Yeah. So I just wanted to quickly kind of ask the committee here if they had any issues with that, or if anyone else was interested in, not issues, but if anyone else was interested in doing that, wanted to share in that role. I think, I might try to go when I'm available as well, but it would be a huge help for you to take on that role for us. If it's also.
Is it a standing meeting date?
That we did cover in our last meeting. So we have standing meeting. We're trying to have it be the second Tuesday of the month, so it falls in between the two meetings. However, we only did 2 meetings out. And we're gonna have to go kind of meeting by meeting. So I am looking at Ms. Fortunato sent me the dates. So I'm looking those up right now. You're ready to write them down when we were talking about them. You don't have to look. I've got it. I told Mr. Liddell to have them. I forgot.
Eric, I'm also happy to help too. If there's time that you need.
Yeah,
December 4th, January 22nd, and February 26th.
Yep. Good. Thank you.
October and February 26th. And what time do you usually do?
Starting at 12:11 and going until about 1:11.
I was waiting for a totally random time to come out.
11:37 to 12:41.
It kind of works in 2 shifts where.
She said 3 days.
Yeah, and just get 3 days.
Yes.
Maybe say them again, sorry.
December 4th,
Got that one.
January 22nd,
That's the one. That's okay.
and February 26th.
Thank you.
It's like 2 shifts around the lunches.
Yeah.
We typically go
And where do you guys typically meet?
usually in the high school conference room. I'd want to vote for the guidance conference room, not because there's windows. But we meet up here at the high school, either in the high school conference room or the upstairs.
Cool. You have a question for someone?
I had sent an email also just saying I was interested, but also recognizing that I've had a chance to do that. So I didn't know if we were going to discuss the option for either rotating or multiple people or how we wanted to do that. Again, I've had the opportunity, so I can understand that, but I also think there's value in continuing.
Sorry, I missed that.
That's all right.
I mean, I probably wouldn't.
Is there anything, having done it before, do you see any barriers to having more than one school committee member there? Space-wise or conversation-wise, or? I don't, but I think that would be a question maybe for the students to see if they are comfortable with that as well. Again, I'm not trying to.
Speak for Stella, she's good at speaking for herself and for the other students. I would say it's an evolving group. So it's, sometimes it's very casual and it's kind of what's on our minds today. Sometimes there's specific things, like when we get into the budget season or when the cell phone thing came up, we came with specific questions that we were seeking feedback on. We, up to this point, tried to really make it be an opportunity for the grownups to be listening. I don't know how grown up we are, the adults to be, the elders to be listening and hearing from the students about where their concerns are and where they would like us to put attention. So I think just come with an open mind and some flexibility. Some days, we have more kids, some days we have less kids, depending on what's going on in everyone's world. Fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment. I personally don't see any issue with having multiple school committee members there. Yeah, just some days there's a lot of people there and sometimes there's not so many people there. Around like the end of the quarter, there's usually not so many people there. Things like that.
January 22nd will be rough.
Yeah.
I think we targeted that one in case we were having decision-making around things in the budget that may have
Yeah.
importance to students or where their input would be helpful for next steps.
I think that one of the things that's positive about like having more school committee members there is like sometimes I think like the students are just looking for like a flushed out explanation of something. If that makes sense, like sometimes there's just something that we just don't understand. And then if we get a full explanation, we can like tell other kids like, this is what's going on. That's, I think, something that's really important in the dialogue.
I think we left it last time. I think this was in the second half of the meeting that we were going to try to, like last year, we kind of came into the end of the year with some real big ideas and then actually got off to a fairly slow start this year. So at one point we were talking about maybe 3 joint meetings in this year where the student advisory might come for like the 5 to 6 o'clock session. And I think we're a little far away from that. So I think in talking with Ms. Fortunato and Ms. Roy and the student advisory, maybe targeting getting at least one in this year and looking toward the spring sometime so we can plan ahead. So everybody can have a conversation together. We're involved.
I think that sounds great. Well, so this is really just a discussion, and I don't think we necessarily need to vote on it. I think this is an official position. So maybe we take it as since you were attending all these meetings last year, or you can sort of take this on and plan on attending, and then if others would like to attend, just check in with Erica or myself, and kind of keep this easy. Does that sound good, Ben?
Yeah, if you just let me know you're planning on coming. I don't think we have a quorum issue because it's more like a workshop. As long as you don't start deliberating or trying to make a decision, I think we'll be okay.
Yes.
We're on a wait list.
Teresa, I don't see any reason, so if you want to continue to run them, I don't see any reason. If Stella doesn't see a reason, it's fine, right?
But also, I hear Jake saying he might want to come. I mean,
We shouldn't outnumber the students.
That's what
Right.
I'm gonna say.
so I guess what I'm saying.
I just offered if there was a need for coverage and we.
Yeah,
wanted to have
gotcha.
somebody-
Gotcha. Okay.
All right, sounds good. That was all I had for my chairman's reports, and moving on to the student report.
Okay. So I had 2 points that we talked about at the student advisory board meeting, I believe last week. The first thing that we talked about was the AP offerings at the school. So obviously our school offers a really high number of APs for such a small school, which I think is fantastic. It also means that a lot of students take a very high number of APs. And we talked a little bit about opening up. So currently, like only juniors and seniors are allowed to take AP classes. We talked a bit about opening up certain APs that are a bit of a slower pace, good like entry level APs to sophomores. So I talked to some students about that. So far, all the opinions that I've received have been positive because I think that making APs exclusively for juniors and seniors does tend to not necessarily put pressure, but maybe lend itself to having students take more those 2 years because they weren't able to sophomore year, so they feel the need to take more to like kind of compensate. And also that I think maybe taking like 1 AP sophomore year gives you a good idea of what an AP class is like. So then you can gauge how many you want to take junior year and senior year before taking a lot. So yeah, I mean, because I took because I took 5 my junior year, I'm taking 6 right now. And I would say that if I'd been able to take 1 or 2 APs freshman or sophomore year, I probably wouldn't have done that high number during my junior and senior years. So yes. And then the second thing that we talked about was our school graduation requirements. Because we don't have an arts requirement to graduate, which I know a lot of schools around us do. I think one of the reasons why we're talking about this is how like some colleges like to see applicants have an arts, like a certain number of arts credits. to apply, which I think some people, especially like I was senior, I think some people have definitely gotten like blindsided by that, knowing like all the University of California schools have an arts requirement that's like people sometimes don't know about. So I think that adding an arts requirement would be something that people are definitely open to because it's preparing us for college. And then the second thing that we talked about was adding a computer science requirement because it's a very like applicable skill to today's day and age. I personally, before high school, hadn't done any computer science, and I took a couple of intro classes, and I had a fantastic experience. I think they're just like really creative classes that allow kids to kind of explore like logic and just other sides that you don't really get to in other classes. And the final thing that we talked about with changing graduation requirements is maybe like making options that kind of work for people's interests, whatever they need. So like some of the computer science classes that I've taken, I would say very much lean into the arts category or like the design category. They're very like hands-on graphic kind of design type situations. So I think like making requirements that are, I guess, like conducive to people's natural interests is something that that's important to the students. That's all.
Right.
Questions?
Yeah, sure.
So a couple of things about the APs jumped out at me. First, I was wondering what you thought. Sometimes I hear from students that the jump from sophomore year to junior year feels really significant. And in thinking about it, I suspect that's because a lot of the students I've heard that from go from taking no APs to suddenly taking a bunch of APs. And I wonder if you've had that experience and if you think that that would kind of ease the transition.
So yes, I did have that experience because I went from taking no APs to taking 5 APs, which is a big jump, especially because I would say sophomore year compared to freshman year. Most people feel that sophomore year is easier than freshman year.
Yeah.
So it is a large jump, and the first, I would say, 2 to 3 months of junior year are really rough for people. And I think that taking at least like 1 AP sophomore year would be a good intro to the pace of the class and what the expectations are, because the expectations do change significantly from, I would say, more like memorization based thinking to much like more production of your own thoughts and just kind of like complexity of what you're producing. The expectations change significantly. So
one follow-up question that, I don't know if you've heard anything about this, but a few years ago, I remember hearing from a lot of students about if you take an AP sophomore year, which I think used to be allowed, usually you make exceptions, there's a GPA impact, right?
yeah,
Because APs, and it became somewhat of a thing among seniors when they realized that anybody who's graduating at the very top of their class was able to do so mostly because their GPA was higher than anybody who had actually followed what was then practice of not taking AP sophomore year was leading them to a lower GPA. So I don't know if you've thought about this or if you've seen like drama surrounding this, but if there's any, would that in your mind open the door to kind of this rush of, oh, I've got to take an AP my sophomore year because I want my GPA to reflect that additional bump?
I think that under the current status quo where like so I was told in my rest of my grade was told that we were absolutely
That was because of the drama.
sophomore year, but there were students in my grade did take a sophomore year. So I think that under status quo where like it's available to certain people, but it's not necessarily like skill based. It's just kind of like who pushes that limit. That's like who pushes the rule on that. I think can cause frustration because it feels like you're a little bit being punished for following the rule. I think that if you were to allow like 1 AP sophomore year, especially like a history or something like that, I think that, I mean, yeah, I do think a lot of people would take advantage of that, but I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, that's a little bit of the context where the conversation was starting to emerge. We were talking about taking US 1,
Yeah.
US 2, and then US AP. And I was a history teacher, but that's very redundant and not necessarily the best use of time. It takes up flexible schedule. So the conversation turned to, well, if you were able to take AP to satisfy the 2 years, what would that give you? Could you take more electives that you had interest in? So it wasn't a, let's pump up AP. It was, does it make sense to look at some different options for people to move through the continuum so that they could take more computer science?
Yeah.
Perhaps.
So are students, sorry, I don't have a high schooler.
Yeah.
Are students typically repeating coursework? Like, are students doing that, taking US history and then taking AP US history? Are they taking biology and then AP biology?
So, yes, yeah, so like, for biology, you take, honors biology freshman year and AP bio, if you choose to do biology junior or senior year. So it's not exactly the same coursework, but
Right.
it is the same idea. The only thing is with AP, with United States history, we take, United States history sophomore year, and then you have the option to take AP US history junior year, and it is the exact same content for the first few months of junior year. So that's the one that I think is a little.
And
Do students-
A broader conversation about some of what Ms. Groy was starting to think about around the program studies for next year. It wasn't just a launch into.
Did any students self-study for AP tests or not anymore?
I know a couple people who are doing it this year. I would say it's not a terribly popular course of action, just because I don't believe they go onto your transcript. And so the only, like, you would only do that if a college would accept your score, and a lot of colleges now are really only accepting like a 4 or 5. So I don't know.
We have a couple of people who couldn't get certain things in a schedule that are taking it online, AP,
Yeah,
and independent studies. It's kind of something else that everyone's looking at for next year.
So first of all, let's all remember that AP are supposed to be college level courses. So if you're talking about going from a sophomore, 8th and 10th grade level classes to 5 APs as a junior, you're essentially saying you've jumped from sophomore to college in effect. How many, I thought we had a rule that you're only supposed to be taking up to 3. How many students are taking 5, 6 APs a year as juniors or seniors?
Have you heard that before?
I know that you're supposed to sign something if you take over 3 A's. I don't know anyone who signed that in the last 2 years, but I think, I don't have like an exact number. I would say it's decently common, especially, it kind of varies from grade to grade. My grade specifically does take like a lot of APs. In my grade, it's not uncommon to take 4 grades at all. I don't have like an exact number, but it's pretty common.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
So regarding the graduation requirements, the idea for an arts requirement, a computer science requirement, or any others. So is this something that process-wise, I'm not sure if you guys talked about it, but being organically brought forth from the student, would that then go to school council for some discussion and then
So it wasn't
inspiration?
back to our student advisory. Mr. Roy was reviewing the program of studies.
Okay.
Thoughts with them and some thinking about what might be proposed by department chairs and their guidance and what they.
Okay.
So this all comes to this group as part of the program of studies if they're going to propose any changes.
Got it. I know that's our thing that we set the graduation requirements. I understand.
Yeah, I was just wondering how much of that could be framed in the context of guidance, for the arts thing, right? Maybe more of a guidance issue to be aware of than a potentially a graduation requirement for everything.
So that's tricky though, because so I had never heard that before, Stella, about the UC schools. And I think probably until the students a junior, at least not thinking about what was my college going to be. I mean, guidance would have to have very specific and individualized advice. Is there a reason you think it would work as a graduation requirement? Because there's so many things that fit into that.
But there's also so many things that different colleges require. If we started using that as the metric to put a graduation requirement in, pretty soon you give no students choice because they've got to take all these things in case their college requires it.
I have to say, I haven't seen a ton of things out of you know, in my students' experience, like a lot of colleges, there haven't been things that their colleges have required that our district doesn't already. So that's why I thought the UC one is interesting.
Yeah, barring the highly specialized schools, which
Yeah.
one would expect.
I think you'll see two things. You'll see phase one and phase two graduation requirements. There might be some discussion about some preliminary things that they're thinking of doing in year for graduation year 27, then 26. 27, sorry. I think you'll see some course recommendation changes for next year based on what I've been briefed on so far, without any significant graduation requirement changes, at least at this point, but looking ahead to 27. Because we are going to have to come up with a little set of requirements because the MCAS is no longer.
Do we phase that in, starting with the with
Yes, that's
students who
all.
are freshmen?
Julie will map it out. She'll read. It all will come before you, and that's her charge to do. I don't want to step in her lane or step on her timeline. She was just, you know, as we would hope she would do, bringing it to a group of students to get some feedback on what their initial discussions are. So they've got, you know, the next 6 weeks. They're going to be working on developing this.
Just so I'm clear, though, when you say coming for 27, you don't mean the class of 27, you mean in 27, starting to bring things forward.
Yep.
Got it.
I just want to remind us that the graduation requirement is our policy, right? So it's embodied in the program of studies, but we need to treat it like a policy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, so.
So.
All right, moving on to the consent agenda. Does anyone have any questions on the consent agenda? We'll split it up into 3 votes tonight. One for the warrants, one for the minutes, and the third for the out-of-state travel.
And bundle them all together as the consent agenda.
Well, Eric, I want to consent the last meeting, right? This part of it.
Got it.
Yeah. So, any general questions? I think, can I have a motion to accept the warrants, 1024 to 1027?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Then we'll vote. So all those in favor? It's unanimous. And can I have a motion to accept the minutes from the school committee meeting on November 5th, 2024?
Moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor? All those opposed? Anyone abstain? All right, and then moving on, can I have a motion to approve the high school out-of-state travel requests from DECA and for the senior rafting trip?
So moved.
Second. Second. All right, any discussion?
I just had a question. How long have we done the senior rafting trip? Has it always been overnight?
We didn't do it for a long time, but like last year was the first year. It was
we had COVID years. What is the,
last one time, 6 flags. What's that? What's your, what's that? We said, oh, just.
That would be Maggie's 5th grade year.
so
5 years ago.
what is the,
On and off for a long time.
what was the determining factor between the seniors still being able to do? I didn't know that we had any overnight trips. I thought that we got rid of all of them when we got rid of the 5th grade.
I think we just got rid of K through 8.
So it is a cutoff that our K through 8s don't do overnight trips, but
Okay, but could you follow through on your question,
what?
which was, what was the rationale? And does it apply? I think is where you were going.
Well, yeah, I guess, but it's a whole,
I can answer that. I mean, the rationale is for the trips that were 5th and 8th, they were considered part of the curriculum. And thus all students had to be able to participate in those events. The high school stuff that you approve is all student activities or voluntary. So
So it doesn't have to be accessible to everybody?
So like a trip to France or a trip to Spain, it's by choice. So you're choosing, your entire class isn't departing and going. The student activities, the kids aren't entitled to it. We can pull the kids out of it if there's a behavioral issue, if there's a academic issue. So that's the distinction that would be made if I was talking with Cole.
Okay.
I mean, if we want to go back, I'd be happy to do reviews of the fifth and eighth grade trips. I mean, those are, in addition to being kind of required or considered part of the overall curriculum, because we shut down school for a period of time and took everybody off campus, either for the eighth grade or for the fifth grade. We also were running out of ways to staff them and have staff away from home for 2 to 3 nights at a time. So a couple of things were bumping up against each other.
There's no staffing issues on the senior trip.
They take volunteers. The advisor goes, considered part of the advisor's responsibility when they sign up for that extra pay. They can use parent volunteers if they choose. They haven't run into problems. If they're going to, they can opt to do a different trip that year. Memory can't serve, but the rafting trip has been around on and off for full time here, but Karen is right, there are years where they have opted to do other things. So if you'd like us to relook at all of it, we can kind of come back and
No,
I'm kind of doing it off the top of my head, in terms of my recollections on some of the arguments and concerns that were being made for each.
No, thanks.
All right, if there's no other discussion, then we can vote. All those in favor? That's unanimous. Thank you. Then we are moving on to subcommittee reports. We can start with syllabus. John, not being here, Teresa.
We have not met. We have not met. We have a meeting Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, virtual brief meeting.
All right, great. Then we can move on to the finance subcommittee. Yeah, Jake, did you guys? Okay. So then the negotiation team also hasn't met, so then we can move on to the policy subcommittee, and I think you guys did meet.
We did read, we start the report out. I wanted to get the report out because I've had to play a bit of catch up, having missed our last subcommittee meeting and started our last meeting when you guys discussed a new policy. But it's been helpful to me, like really have a chance to dig in and try to understand some of the differences between what Jake and Anna and I had worked on and the policy you all spoke about last week. And I think for purposes of tonight, and certainly for this report out, what we'd like to do is focus on a number of items where we need some input from the whole committee. There are, I think, 4 things that we wanted to talk about that the committee, the policy that Jake and Anna and I drafted did not address. And so this policy puts these directly before us, and we do need some input on them. The first is OPEB. We didn't include OPEB when we first thought about a reserve policy because it's not something that has traditionally been included, in our bar charts when we look at reserves. That hasn't in the past included OPEB. Yet, when you think about it, OPEB is one, very much a reserve. And 2, I know several of us, myself included, have had questions last year. David, you may have been one of them as well. When we looked at the budget about how and when we can use OPEB. So a question for this community is whether or not there should be a reserve policy, and it doesn't need to be incorporated necessarily into a broader reserve policy. Maybe it's its own because OPEB definitely has a distinct mandate. But it's something we want to input on. And I think maybe I'll walk through. I think there's 4 buckets or 4 items that we're looking for some feedback on. So OPEB is one. The next item is, as you guys have all seen, the policy that you discussed last week includes an 8% target in the first paragraph, but it also includes a target within the E&D section of 3%. That's a number that we got from looking at a number of different policy. I think it's in at least Masco, Hamilton, Wenham, and Craig. And this was sort of hard for me to wrap my head around in terms of how how this plays out. I think it's really abstract, so I actually had Michelle give me some numbers so I could think about it, and I'm going to share them with you just as a way to think about what this would mean. 3% of our budget is approximately $1 million. These are rough numbers, right? So approximately $1 million. So if E&D is finalized around 1.4 million, we'd be talking about 400,000 and trying to, through a reserve policy, maintain the 1 million, the 3% as a reserve. That gets into, so when I identify that 400,000, it gets into my next question really. So one question is, do we try to establish a 3% or some other number threshold? And the second question is then, use of anything in excess of 3%, which leads into another category of questions, which is, should we think about our reserve policy identifying how to fund stabilization account? And this, again, I have to really wrap my head around whether this was a yes or a no, a good or a bad. As I told these guys earlier, sometimes less is more in a policy, but there are other times where like these are real significant questions that we should be talking about as a committee. So when it comes to stabilization, the distinction that I want to raise that was important for me to think about is E&D, we typically think about as a rainy day fund in the way I traditionally think of a reserve in general. When it comes to stabilization, stabilization is in fact how we fund our capital budget. So when we're thinking about a building, this building in particular, that's an aging building, do we want to think about a specific plan for making sure that we have reserves in place such that when the roof needs to be repaired, the boiler needs to be repaired, we're not having to return to the town to ask for these things. I think that the items that I just discussed probably have some pros and cons on either side of them, but I do appreciate that this policy, while maybe not exactly the language we look for, identifies a few high-level issues that I think we really should be discussing as a committee and coming to some consensus on. The only other thing I wanted to mention was in the first paragraph of the draft you all talked about last week, there was a sentence that related to financial rating agencies recommending as much as 15%. That's a true statement. I'm just not sure. I think we agreed as a committee that we're not sure that's necessary to include in our policy. If we're going to set a target of 8%, we'll set the target of 8%, and I don't think we need to. There's a lot of true things out there what financial rating agencies say, and I'm not sure we need to put them all right here. So I think that's it. So the buckets again are to talk about whether we should develop a reserve policy surrounding OPEB, whether we should have a threshold, 3% is the proposal, but it could be something else for our E&D reserve, and whether we should develop and memorialize a specific practice for funding the stabilization reserve account through our policy. All right, guys, what did I forget?
That was good. I would add that another important distinction between the EMD and the stabilization is that stabilization is easier for us to spend as a committee during the year. EMD requires us to amend the budget in order to access that. Whereas if we have transferred from EMD to stabilization, we can choose to just vote to use stabilization funds. It's the same money, it's just where we're keeping it. Do those accounts bear the same amount of interest, or are we?
Yes, they will. I mean, we're in the process of setting up a separate account for stabilization, essentially the same investments.
Can you tell us what's the balance as of now in all four buckets?
Right now, in stabilization, we have 1.5 million, just over 1.5. Our E&D is projected at 1.4 million. Our OPEB, I believe, is 5.8. Yeah, it's either 5.8 or 5.
What's the mandate for OPEB? Or what is required? Or we have kind of like a
Well, eventually,
Or
we
contractual balance.
need to be fully funded eventually, but that's so far off that
literally after my lifetime, this one. So there's no mandate about how much that we have to put in, at what level?
No, there is. We are contractually bound. What was the,
It's it's in the teacher's
Yeah.
contract, so it's not a state contractual obligation.
So if it's contractual required,
Yes.
how much that we need to put in that pot of money? Why do we need a reason, a policy specific to identify it?
Well, like,
Regarding
here's what we talked about today, is that we're contractually bound to make certain payments. However, depending on what the balance is, there are times when we can use a portion of our contribution. Like last year, we did use a portion of the OPEB contribution to fund operating expenses. Probably not best practices, but we did. That was part of our budget.
So contractually, it's not required us to always put in X amount, like we can decide the X amount. Is that what?
Contractually, we're bound to put in the difference between the cost of the previous healthcare plan back to year before we negotiated to open the OPEB trust. And in that year, we made a significant change in plan design and contribution rates. So every year, Michelle has to go back and replicate what we would have spent on the plan prior to the funding, the establishment of the OPEB account. Calculate the savings that we made in the new plan, and the delta between the two is what's supposed to be contributed to the OPEB. So it's not a set, it's a set formula, but the amount will fluctuate from year to year.
So last year, we put in less. And based on the calculation, that is still okay.
no.
I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah,
If the
it's, I would say it is a gray area, right? So we made the contribution less $150,000 on paper. If we can make the $150,000 contribution because we come out in the plat this year, we will. If we don't, it gets earmarked against reducing the growth of retiree health, which is the purpose of the fund in the agreement made with the association for keeping the fund and funding the fund, which is to defer the cost, to offset the cost of growth for retiree health, so it doesn't squeeze out the rest of the budget. That's a mouthful, I know. So I think it's a gray area. We even recognize that we have to go back and look at this, and we have written into our current contract a review of this formula in this process. I think it's FY 27 before we negotiate again. But it's, it's kind of like funding your 401k. It's a 30-year process to full funding or some crazy number like that.
So I appreciate the clear articulation of input you're looking for. I did make a number of comments last time, but I'll respond to the 3 bullets I think there. OPEB, I'm totally fine including it in the policy. I think one of the purposes of having the policy is to define what our reserve accounts are. Right before we went down this road, that was a gray area, and we had different things, and we've been doing that through this process, and we memorialize it in the policy. So I'm fine with that in there. I think I pointed out last time that any reference we have to a target or a percent needs to account for the fact that we are, the operational target we have for our, or the reserve, the target we have for kind of operational capital use should not include OPEB, because that's a different purpose. In terms of the 3% E&D quote unquote threshold, I am okay with having a target at the top of 8% at a total across our reserve accounts. I think we've always talked about the fact that E&D has a built-in cap, right? We can't go over 5, and we were all comfortable with that, and we can have basically any amount below that we choose. So I'm not quite sure the reason for having the 3, other than it puts a ceiling on it, which we all informally took a straw poll and said that we were okay with just a target, not a floor and a ceiling. So I'm not quite sure how that changed by saying it's going to be 3%, how that changes anything for us kind of on a day-to-day basis. I if the Triton example is included and we include, right now, the version that we have for stabilization fund has, a 10% cap on it too. To me, if we decide on a number for E and D, then the stabilization should be set so that the total is 8, so that we maintain that target. Otherwise, we now have a total of, I think I said it was like 13 or something percent.
Right.
Which is moving away from the intent that we were heading with the first draft. And then, in terms of direction on funding the stabilization fund, it is important to have a capital plan and funding for that. It is important to have a plan for funding it. I do not think a policy is the way to direct a plan. That is a strategic planning process. That is a budgeting process. I don't think a policy is where you lay out your plan for funding capital accounts.
We agree. There's a number of things in here that we discussed today that aren't necessarily appropriate for this. So that's why I think right now the questions, like the hope is to put forth these very specific questions, because there are things in here and there may be other questions that we need to discuss as a committee as well. So we're nowhere near like first grade style, that sort of thing. But with regard to these specific things, that will be able to take us to the next step.
I just want to say, to me, this, through the time that I was on the subcommittee and working on this, the policy had 3 goals. 1, to define the reserve accounts. 2, to specify how each is funded and guidance for our use of those funds. And 3, articulate a target. So I appreciate that you've made explicit what additional goals may be, but I still think we should just stick to those 3 and get it done.
But didn't you just say that one of them was to specify how they're funded?
Yeah, which is, we take a 2/3 vote to, right? I mean, it's the mechanism that we have to follow, right? Not the plan for, we give 250,000 to it or something like that.
Right, so the wording that we had come up with today was the school committee will decide on an annual basis whether to transfer E and D above 3% to the stabilization fund. None of these are written in stone, this is just us brainstorming. But so having it in writing means that there has to be a school committee discussion on it, and there has to be a decision, a mindful decision one way or the other.
There's nothing that prevents us
Based
from
on-
having that conversation and decision.
Yeah.
Right, but there's nothing that binds us to.
Right, but why 3%? I mean,
That was
Fun-
also the
function.
recommendation from our auditor.
I don't know that it needs to be, I'm not type of 3%. We did find it in a number of policies and it was a recommendation, but I think we could even just discuss conceptually, whatever percentage we put it at, is there value in, for future committees, establishing a process that, of course, in exceptional circumstances, will not be adhered to, because all of these policies have lots of language about, unforeseen, whatever. But would it make sense for us, recognizing what our capital needs are going to be not too long from now, to memorialize that intent? Or do you think that's just simply,
I guess I'm wondering how putting that percentage in there kind of, I'm just not sure how it operationalizes in a productive
So
way.
the recommendation from the auditor was that we have a minimum of 3% in there. So the line of thinking is that when E and D comes back above 3%, we know exactly how much is in that cushion. This year it's about 400,000. We can decide as a committee for that 400,000, knowing that we're still keeping our finances sound per the recommendations that we have. We can decide what to do with that 400,000, whether it is roll it forward into the next operating budget because we foresee the need for that, or put it into the stabilization fund because we foresee the need for that, or some combination of both.
So
But
why lock ourselves into rolling it to the stabilization rather than leaving ourselves open to make that choice during budget season?
No,
That is what.
that is what we're proposing.
That's again, the language in here is different from what we've discussed today, so that's why we're coming with specific questions.
Then I'm not following, so I'll back off here. I'm not following where this is going.
So if we've set a floor for E and D, we know exactly that amount that we have to play with, right? As opposed to looking at, okay, we've got 1.4 in D&D, we've got 1.5 in stabilization. How are we gonna fund the gaps in the operating budget? And are we going to put money towards future capital expenses?
Are you asking what's the purpose of the three, or are you, can you just remind me?
I'm
what
trying
your
to,
question
trying
is?
to understand what the 3% does for us that we, A, can already do,
Mhm.
and B, how does it prevent us from being locked into choices that we have to make rather than choices we want to make?
So the answer to the first part of that is that it gives us somewhere to go back to, a grounding space, something to go back to for keeping the district's reserve levels at a minimum healthy balance. So that at all times, unless there is something so unforeseen like a worldwide pandemic, right? That E&D, we know, is always going to have 3%. We're not going to have to worry about the bond rating. And then beyond that,
So it's setting a floor. What you just said is it's setting a floor.
Yes.
yeah,
And that is not where we were prior. So it's helpful to hear that that's what you're thinking.
I think the other thing, it would, the language that exists in the Triton policy has you building your stabilization fund, which is at the uses at the approval of the school committee, as opposed to growing your E&D fund, which would have to be approved through an amended budget and to a vote of the school committee and to town meetings. So it's committing you to fund school-based projects with your reserves and maintaining control of the school committee over those resources. Greater autonomy in how to manage the dollars.
One concern I have when I continue to stare at these numbers is if it's at the floor at 3%, and if we're recognizing that we're going to have capital expenses that we need to prepare for, I feel like we're going to pretty rapidly exceed our target. Because if 3% is always going to be around $1 million, and right now stabilization is at 1.4. We like keep growing in a way that we can't do the two things. Like we can't set the floor at 3 and have a target at 8 because it's not going to.
Because we're not so much in
coming out. I'm wondering if our target is 8, if a floor of 3% will make it hard to end up where we're setting our target.
We can only have a max of 1.5 in stabilization.
No, in E&D.
In E&D, sorry, we only have the max of 1.5 in E&D.
Right.
And if we're saying that we can never go below, or we're holding ourselves to not going below 1 million, that means we limit ourselves at best to 500,000.
And you're saying why?
So I guess, let me try this. What problem are we trying to solve by setting the 3%? Is there an existing problem right now that will require us to set the 3%?
I don't know if it's a problem, but you could address concerns, issues, problems, label them as you will. Do you want to be spending more than $500,000? Like, you would cap the amount of money you would use in operating to 2% of E&D. So you would cap it 500,000. Because right now, I think we're going to have a different conversation tonight, but at some point we'll have to have the conversation about the sustainability of using reserves as revenue when they start to become running up too big of a credit card bill.
But what you're actually saying is that 500,000 goes into stabilization. We're saying
No.
it's primarily capital.
No,
So we're
we're
actually
saying-
limiting ourselves.
So we're saying that we have that the school committee decides how much of that 500,000 goes into the next year's operating budget.
Instead of stabilization, those two options.
Yes. That really what we're defining is that the amount that we have to work with, that sort of.
You can leave it open.
It's nice. Sorry.
Just, their policy is trying to achieve something specific.
And I think to answer your question, and I'm truly torn about which way to proceed, but in terms of the problem we're trying to solve, there is something in my mind appealing about getting to budget season, finding, we'll have a certified E&D number and knowing we have $500,000, how much of it should we be putting to operating and the remainder goes to stabilization? And that is what we do as a committee. Every year, that is what we do. Make sure we have enough in reserves to meet a rainy day need And the rest of it, we make the decision where the greatest needs are. And I guess operationally, that feels smooth to me. It feels like we just all know what's on the table and what we're dealing with. I'm not sure. It also doesn't give us as much discretion because I'm not sure if 3% is a magic number. I'm not sure that some years we wouldn't want to dip below it. I'm also not sure if this policy would really prevent that because it's going to say the target. So I think it's just really, it really is something that I wanted to hear the rest of the committee's views on. Like, does it help us to have this? Does it hurt? I can see the less is more approach to. So,
To that point, that is what I see the benefit of that process right there, which is in recent years, each time it comes up, we've got all this money in reserves and we've got the operating deficit here. How are we going to use this? How much are we going to use? And what I keep hearing from committee members and even some community members is it feels very haphazard or very, just not very methodical about how are we deciding how much is appropriate to use versus isn't appropriate to use. And this is the point of policy, right? To give us some guidance on that. And so that's where I feel the benefit of that is, again, with being very clear that the committee take an intentional look at it and make the decision, that it doesn't necessarily have to roll over, but it also does highlight and really put into policy the understanding that we need to be aware of funding stabilization. We've been living on money from earned interest from the memorial build, and that is dwindling. And it will continue to dwindle, and it's not sustainable. We say it every year, and then we argue about it every year, but it's really not. And so we do need to. I think it's beneficial to codify here that there's a plan for that, or at least an opportunity where we're specifically looking at that, because small cap is the first thing to get cut, because we want to keep our teachers, and so there's a mechanism here for that I think is really valuable.
But fundamentally, even if we commit ourselves in policy to doing that, that doesn't change the budget conversation.
No, it doesn't, but it gives us the structures.
I think that's the goal.
So right now we're over 8%, yeah?
Slightly.
Yeah, so why can't we, if we only have the maximum, instead of having the ceiling, not, the floor, 3%? Why can't we just say that, if it's over the max, it goes into the operating? What, because if we were to restrict the E&D versus stabilization, there are so many things in the fine print. So how do you, like, what goes into, come out of the, what's categorized as a capital expense? Because I think right now, sometimes it could be in the small cap, sometimes it could be in the capital. And we will need to define everything. I do feel like less is more when it comes to policy. And that gives us more flexibility every year for school committee to make decisions on, because things change. Like, you don't want to lock yourself into specific things so strictly. And in my opinion, less is more. We can have a specific separate guideline about what we want to handle, when it's like below 3%, when it's below, whatever that might be. But I think in the policy itself, it should be, think about it, policy should be something that can stay for a long time, 5-10 years. You don't want to keep changing the policy. When you're so into the detail like that, you end up changing policies every few years when things change.
Are we discussing a specific question right now, or are we just taking input?
That's a good question.
Well, I think that's what.
No, which message goes on?
Yeah. I think what I understood tonight you'd be saying is she doesn't like the 3% floor because we can do some of the same thing, just looking at the 8% target.
Yeah.
And using anything in excess of that. Although, and I wanted to follow up with that and say, the way you just said it was in excess of the 8% would go toward operating. So does that mean that you don't want to think about as a committee a specific process for funding stabilization?
We could, but it doesn't have to be in policy.
So can I comment that's the kind of thing that I was getting out of the first run through of this. That's the kind of flexibility I'm hoping we can work toward, which is getting away from that, because if we say anything over our target, gets put into the operating budget, that doesn't give the opportunity for long-term planning for capital needs. Where we're over right now, and if we followed that guideline of anything over that target going into the operating budget, then our upcoming capital needs in the next few years would not be able to be met because that money is accounted for in upcoming projects.
In my opinion, if you want to plan for stabilization, which is to fund the capital expenses, I get that there's a lot of things that is in the pipeline that's coming. You do need to plan for the long-term planning for operation too. So that way the two can go side by side. Because when you, let's say like, if it's not in the policy and the school committee wants to say that grow the stabilization into right now it's 1.5 to go to 3 million, and here is the plan. For us to put in or commit 500K, 400K, even $50,000 every year to this pot for the next capital expenses for 5, 10, 20 years. We gotta look at, is there enough to strategic plan to fund all the programmatic activities for the long term? What does that mean? So the two have to go together. Without that, how are we gonna grow into the stabilization plan? Let alone have a policy to kind of limit us what we need to do.
Right,
So-
because
so-
shouldn't our policy address both?
No, I think what Anna and I are trying to say is that we can accomplish the same thing through the budget and strategic planning.
Yes.
We're questioning whether you have to codify that in the policy.
Okay.
We can still have those commitments. We can still do exactly what you're asking for, because we need to be planning for capital gain, for capital projects. It's part of our budget, right? What the policy,
It's not part of our budget. That's,
what can be part of our budget, right? We can choose to do that.
Yeah.
Right? We can also choose to, as we can choose to transfer E and B into stabilization fund, right? When we choose. So we can do all these things. The question is, do we need to codify
Yeah.
a funding mechanism in a policy?
We haven't codified it in the proposed
So
policy.
that's what I hear you trying to do.
No, we are trying to define how much, where are we getting money to fill the gaps in our operational budget? While also knowing that we can't draw it out of our stabilization fund because we already have all of that money plus more earmarked for future capital needs, upcoming in the near future capital needs.
We're limiting this out.
I'm not seeing
I don't
policy
see a
as
limit.
limiting. I find, so I guess maybe this is just a sort of a philosophical question. I find policy to be a little bit more freeing, actually, to know what the structure is and what the outline is. I find that to be useful in community conversations, to be able to, what people are saying, well, if you've got, $1.4 million there, why aren't you putting that toward the operating budget? Well, in our policy that we all worked through as a group in 2024, here's what we decided and why. I think it's helpful to have that roadmap and that baseline, similar to a strategic plan for those sorts of things.
So let's
That,
say-
to me, I find that valuable.
So let's say if we have a policy to say that we want to grow stabilization to whatever, let's say 2 million, $3 million. And then for whatever reason that on the operational program side, there has to be an investment to do something, then we won't be able to access this because we're going against our own policy.
But we haven't set a target for growing stabilization. We haven't set this. All right, I don't know if you're confusing the Triton policy, which specified a specific amount that was supposed to go
We're not-
in
So,
here.
so maybe what we need to do is, it feels like we're starting to go in circles or repeat ourselves. So maybe what we need to do is give it back to the committee. Like Chris hasn't spoken up though, so he may have something to say, but give it back to the committee, do a draft. So
Yeah,
that we
the
can
framework.
actually look and see what the implications might be.
I do think you're chipping into what is an underlying question that hasn't really been discussed, which is, should the collective be using one-time funds to invest in building programs? And we have always operated, and I strongly believe we should not use one-time funds to expand the budget or invest in the program because we don't have a mechanism for continuing those funds in the future. So the thought has always been that the E and D usage as reserve, as revenue is a bridge loan. So I think you guys do need to discuss, if you see this more as a system, as a long-term use of E and D and using it to supplement revenue that's coming in and using it now to potentially add and expand, not just back to that horrible phrase, level service. We're gonna accelerate the problem and create a much larger gap to be solved in the future. But it's not a right or wrong, it's just a how do you want to approach it?
I have a follow-up thing on that, Pam, because this idea of a fund we've been talking about for years now. And yet, can you help us understand, like, each year we do seem to have money in our E&D, in our excess, to be able to get back to the budget, which, you know, we have had some of our, you know, partners interested in seeing that money go back to the budget, which I understand too, as a taxpayer, like, all things being equal, you would sometimes prefer to see money offset whatever the towns are gonna have to pay, but. So I guess my question is, can you help us understand why we need to be quite as concerned? Because it totally made sense to me originally that you're creating a funding cliff, a gap that you have to fill. But that hasn't been the case in reality, so why do we think it's going to be?
I think it's going to be, I don't want to go back too far. We had every intention of paying for the fields through reserve funds. So that's why we had the initial conversation of once we spent those dollars would be gone. That's why we were keeping money on hand. We had made pledges year after year that we would fund those fields. Collectively, we all decided to go in a different direction. It took me some convincing for me to get on board, but I understood the reason why. So had we not been reimbursed the $1.5 million, we would not have $1.5 million in our stabilization currently, so we would be at zero with just the ending. So we avoided that by partnering with our towns, going out, Manchester going out to borrow and Essex funding us through their small cap. We do see in the next 5 years, $1.9 million in capital expenses, facilities maintenance, aside from Essex Elementary. And we have $1.5 million in our stabilization account, but no mechanism to replenish that. So this year, it looks like we're going to have about $200,000 in expenditures. I know that Michelle's working with Jason to prepare a mid-year approval package. So we can complete some of our items, and then looking at FY26 right now, we're looking at an estimate of $426,000. So 691, 472. So 691 over 2 years of $1.5 million without a mechanism for replenishing stabilization. So I do think we're going to start to see a drawdown. Also, where we ended the year last year was tighter than the year before, which was tighter than the year before. So it's starting to get, it's not going to happen overnight, but if we have enough successive years where we're spending for stabilization and not replenishing, and spending for P&D while cutting the budget tighter and tighter each year, it will start to slow.
Yep, that makes sense.
Can I just ask clarification when you say be worried about one-time money? Do you view E&D as one-time money,
Yes.
even though we've added to it basically each year?
Past couple of years, it has been primarily as a result of investment earnings. I don't think we're going to keep up with the interest rates that we've been getting through the MMTT. Currently, we're receiving about 5% on our income, which is equating to about $350,000 a year. So about $350,000 or $300,000 of the E&D is coming directly from our investment earnings.
And is that related to still money that we have from the Memorial Sloan Building project?
A little bit of it.
We still have money.
We have not closed the project yet. We're waiting for MSBA to do our final reimbursement. Until they do that final reimbursement, we can't hold on for it.
Okay, thank you.
And I think the other way to look at it for the one-time money is we're using that money to bridge a gap in our ability to assess. So that's why I probably harp on level services more than it's comfortable for people, which is our basic annual cost of doing business rolling forward, not expanding or adding. We're keeping the same heads and paying our obligations. costs us more than we're raising in assessment. So we have to go to the piggy bank, the credit card, whatever you want to call it. And every year it's going to inch up how much we need to grab from there to make it work. So if you do, let's say 5 years from now is the time period where you want to go for an override. That number is going to continue to grow over 5 years. So when you pull that plug out, we've seen it happen. The number that gets passed to the towns for an override is not only the cost of that year, but it's the cost of replacing that gap money that we haven't realized over the course of the year.
I would recommend that, while you guys work on the policy, maybe the finance subcommittee run some numbers to see what does it look like if it's, 1.5, and then compared to the capital expense forecast, what does that mean? So I think that will give everybody a full picture, and maybe that'll help us decide what the policy should say.
Or what the outcomes of the policy would be in real terms.
So probably times, yes.
Yeah.
So we can have.
That's great.
I think these are great conversations. I want to show you this one.
Can I ask just one more question though? Because so we're charged with moving forward to create a cleaner draft for everyone to look at. But is there any, one thing that we took from this in terms of directionality on the questions, Erica?
Where did y'all come out on?
We should define it,
It's, yes,
but not include in the calculation or whatever.
define it as a
Not part of
reserve.
the- Not part of the calculation.
So, and just wanted to point to, if you haven't, your interest hasn't been piqued yet, there's a whole page dedicated to OPEB, the history of OPEB, what it is, how we've arrived at it, and we issue a letter every spring that explains what it is, where we are, how we calculate it. So if I stop sharing this, so that's the page where anybody can find it, because I know we've got some people watching at home. And we also have the annual OPEB letter, which includes, which you would download from that page. And it shows what our liability is. So this is a number that I guess will always float in my head and in Michelle's head is according to the actuary, our unfunded liability for OPEB is 23.3. Okay, and we have about $4 million toward that at this point in time. So we're not close to full funding and we have a long way to go to get there. So deferring 150 in 1 year probably isn't going to slow the train down too much. But if we do too much over time, it could. So this whole letter outlines annually kind of how we get to the contribution, where it's drawing from, what the impact is, and what we know based on our latest actuarial reports where it's invested, et cetera, et cetera. So, and here's the annual number. So in our 10-year projection, we'll be at 4.6 million. So
Scary thing is we're in decent shape compared to others.
Yes.
we are.
We're actually, the most recent report, just to update that, we're at 5.8 million with a total liability of 27.7. So those are just released figures last month.
This was what, the March?
Yeah, that was March. That was actually.
Yeah. So, but there, I mean, this is kind of how we've learned along the way what it's all about.
Okay, so policy subcommittee, do you have what you need, or is there another question you want to take a straw poll on, or are we good?
I think that's it.
I mean, should we take straw polls?
I mean, I could give my 2 cents in general, so I thought the whole intent of putting this, or exempting this policy was to provide guidelines. So I am for providing guidelines. I don't think there's any negative to doing that. I do understand you don't want to be overly concise with those guidelines. You know, the amount of time that I think we've all spent on this policy, that kind of makes a lot of sense. So, but we do want to just be thoughtful about it. And that's really what I would like to see it. So I don't see any issue with the work that you guys have done so far. I think it's been great. We're heading in the right direction.
OPEB?
Okay. Yeah, included in the policy, sure.
Got it.
I don't see why not. If we want to have guidelines that we can communicate out and provide us some guidance, then should absolutely.
What would be the open guideline, like not to use it, like we should only,
That's what we'll have to take up. at another
That's what-
meeting.
yeah, that's-
There are lots of pieces to this, that this kind of conversation should take place, and that's one of them.
If we pull out the original strategic plan, so to speak, for OPEB, about 80, my recollection is 80% of it was supposed to come from the reorganization of healthcare and the annual contribution based on that savings. Then about 20% of it is supposed to come from additional dedicated line in our operating budget that tries to fund the gap. So that's why you probably see me get a little stressed. Things like stabilization and capital planning funding, OPEB, like they're just, we never get to the point of being able to realize them or include them, because if, once we start including them in the operational budget, that just becomes another weight on the assessment. So we tended to pull those things out right away, so we can keep that number as low as possible.
And am I understanding correctly that I think we're contractually obligated to have a certain number for OPEB in our operating budget?
We're not contractually obligated for the extra, we're just contractually obligated not to take the savings from the two plans and use it for another reason. That has to go into the OPEB, or to offset the cost of retirement.
But what about that 20% differential?
It's on the district to fund it.
so how are we able to not fund 150K?
Because we used it to offset the increased cost of retiree health, which is the purpose of the trust. So we can withdraw from the trust at any point in time to fund retiree health. So that's what we
We're
did,
just
but as we
reducing,
do,
we're just reducing our ability to meet the life.
taking longer to get. Yeah,
And that's a lot.
it's allowed because it went to retiree health. Yeah. It's
I see what you're saying.
All right, so then moving on to,
yeah, I covered quite a few little tidbits on how, very quick report, we can get back into kind of some fun conversation. So you were talking about it off the top, great show over the weekend, 3 nights, I think attendance was fantastic every night. First combined middle high school play. It was very funny. Most of the tech worked really well. I think you said they got the small little problem from Friday night fixed, and it was the first time we had a live orchestra in the pit. And it was a lot of fun, very upbeat, and just a well done show. So just kudos to everyone who was involved. Nice way to kick off the holiday season. And just a couple of quick updates. So very briefly in the news, we started talking about Costello was here. So as of December 5th, there will be no more MCAS graduation requirement for 10th graders. And that's all we know at this point. They didn't have anything ready to go for us, but we're waiting guidance documents from the state on what they would like us to do. I think the biggest question I have, what people are batting around is, do districts still have the local authority to require MCAS as a graduation requirement? My kind of wondering is, how long do you sustain the 10th grade MCAS if it has no weight? When they're already kind of starting to move on to other things and be involved in other testing batteries. So I think the law still says we're required to give it. How long is it? So I think we're just kind of waiting to see what DESE has to say about what they're thinking, where they're going with it. We've seen, more people opt out over time. Are they going to ding us if kids don't come in and take the test because they opt to stay home that day? There's kind of a lot of what ifs that we don't really have answers for yet. And it's going to put, I think it's going to put us in a healthy position of having to look at our graduation requirements slightly differently. That's why I was talking with Julie and Heather. I said, think about what you really need in the short term for next year, but knowing that we're probably going to need to take this on in a larger, bigger picture conversation as we get out into 2027. So the other thing that we're watching, and I take no position on this, only to know that every community is discussing, and we're kind of pushing through the state organization questions that we have. We're fortunate we're not dealing with what if ICE comes to take kids, but we are kind of waiting and watching to see what's going to happen with the federal funding. Why another reason we want to make sure we have healthy reserves. And again, there's a lot of, people are all over the place with how we should interpret what's going to happen. But I think there is a school of thought that says federal funding could be used as a leverage tool for states, and we rely on federal funding primarily, like about $400,000 for special education funding, Title I funding. So there's a chunk of money tied up. And there's some speculation that there could potentially be 9C cuts this year or some impact to next year. So there's nothing really to do there but be aware of it and have it maybe in the back of our minds when we're doing some of our budgeting for next year. It's just a little bit of a wild card. Around the district, library task force is meeting tomorrow to kick off, and our hope is to have kind of a report out by the fall of next year to inform budgeting for 27 and have some short-term and long-term components in there. So things that we could do next year and then things we might want to plan for in the long run. The guiding question is what do we want the library of 2030 to look like? Push is really that we do not focus on trying to replicate something from the past as nostalgic as we may be for the old fashioned library, but to build something that's going to sync up with the direction we're trying to go in terms of authentic learning and really what the needs of students are in the future. So it's a healthy group. We have about 20 people. So excited to get that started. We are exploring all options around busing. We've had some difficult conversations and some intriguing meetings about what our options may be. So kind of stay tuned on that. Salter's committed to us that they have drivers in the pipeline and that they're going to be working hard to improve quality of services. And we appreciate that, but Michelle's also been doing a lot of legwork on looking at what an RFP would look like and how we would exercise our options to exit the contract if we don't see some
It's like
substantial.
we've had a bit of a reprieve while our neighbors have a reprieve from learning.
And then we just have our ongoing projects, reviewing the K-12 phone alignment, the alignment of the phone policies K-12, and principals are still working on a model schedule to then take out core feedback. Preview, before you know it, the holidays will be here. We've got 3 big concerts coming up. The combined elementary concert here, the high school concert, and then the middle school has their winter concert in January after the break. So we're going to start to publicize that now so people can mark their calendars. And then that is about it since our last meeting, other than we've been focusing on budget development. Principals and directors have been working hard at their level, meeting with their leadership teams, drafting their budgets, which are formally due tomorrow. I know we have several in hand already. And then over the next week, Michelle and I will make sense of all of their numbers and then make some decisions about how to put together the tentative budget, which will come to you probably happy Thanksgiving, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I'll get you your packets because we have a meeting the Tuesday after. So have all that extra turkey in your sleep and you can start looking at those spreadsheets. So the goal tonight is really just I think the goal is to do it a little differently this year and not start with what we see as the obstacles, but talk about what you're looking for in terms of outcomes from the budget. I sent a few kind of prompts. Those aren't the only questions, but there's some questions that now is the time if we want to change course and how we do things that we can set that up and we'll do our best to reflect that in the tentative budget.
And so along those lines, I know last meeting we spoke about coming with just general ideas or thoughts about budget season. So does anyone have or anyone want to speak to that at all? We can just kind of go around and around and around. So Teresa, firsthand, please go ahead.
So taking your prompts, do we want to just start with do one at a time, or do you want just all my thoughts and then we'll give them out?
I would like all your thoughts.
Okay. Going in reverse order of your prompts. Well, because last year, areas for growth and key takeaways or lessons, I thought that it was valuable last year that we had specific requests from both towns regarding what they were hoping for. And it sounds like we may get such a thing this year as well because of the joint FinCom meeting coming up this week. We were able to take that information early on and then have that as part of our discussion And I also think that it was really valuable that quite early on in the process, we all came to a consensus that the goal was to stick with level services and to avoid cuts. That was kind of the baseline we were moving forward from. And then, there was work to do beyond that, but I think that was really valuable. It gave our towns time to plan. It gave our administrators time to work with a specific focus rather than all the focuses. And I think that we did a really good job with that. As far as the common definition of budget narrative, I'm not sure we will be able to do this, but if we are, as much as we are, I think that a philosophical statement about what we're trying to accomplish will be a lot and enough. Like as in, we are trying to protect what we have and move towards stability, whatever it may be, but even just something simple like that we can go back to. That's really all I have for that. On non-META salaries and addressing that growth rate, I have a quick question on that. We're talking about administrators and then some employees like kitchen, grounds, that sort. I mean, is that?
It's mostly administrative support staff, so administrative assistants, our small facilities department.
Yeah.
Tech.
Okay. That's all right. I just wanted to clarify that.
And
So,
then some principals and directors, but
Yeah.
it is more individualized. I'm in the process of surveying around to see what other districts' structures look like. And in some cases, we are way below, and in some cases, we're way above. So I'm starting to put together an average. You've alluded to the fact that two of our key neighbors are a little offline right now.
Yeah.
So it's been a little slow getting some information in.
Right.
But I think we'll be able to have probably more targeted approach to that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have some curious what people's thoughts are on how you want to go about addressing it, but I don't think it has to be a blanket across the board.
yeah, my thoughts on that are very high level and not having any granular detail, but my inclination is to say, to focus first on staff who haven't had a reset rate lately, a salary reset through a new position coming online, to really focus on those people first and then gradually go toward that other direction. But that's as far as I've taken that
Read my
thought.
mind, because that was the other point I wanted to make, that's, and just so we're all hearing the same thing. We've restructured some of the positions in the past 3 or 4 years. When we reset positions or we went out to rehire positions which stayed, we were able to go with what the market rate was. So they have experienced adjustments, whereas we have some people who have just, they came in during the 2.5 years and it got a little stuck. So I think we're trying to tease out which ones needed more significant adjustment.
Yeah. And then for the final, the meat and potatoes of what we're discussing for this budget season, what I would really like to see is knowing that we have a lot of uncertainty ahead with a number of different things. I would like to start from a baseline of level services to give our staff and our students and families and communities the security that we will protect what we have already, which is very good. I would really appreciate a look at, and this is dependent on, workload, you understand, but a look at a planned graduated reduction of reserves over time as a funding source. I think it's too much on our communities to pull it all at once. But if we work toward a planned graduated reduction in that, the pinch will be smaller each time.
Do you mean the use of reserves?
Yes, a reduction in the use of reserves as
So you
a funding source.
reserves.
No, sorry, reduction of use of reserves as a funding source for the operating budget. With one small exception, which is that, well, not an exception, concurrently in this budget, I would like to see consideration of use of reserves regarding extraordinary healthcare costs. It sounds like we may have another year of extraordinary healthcare costs, which we had in 2016, which ate up a good amount of the overrider extra funding that came in from the towns. I think that's exceptional. So we would have to determine what the average is typically and make some determination there. But that's something that I think would be an appropriate use of reserves for an exceptional use. But starting from a baseline of protecting what we have, not going all out for big growth. We know it's a time for some fiscal conservative approach. But it is important to protect what we have and give the confidence to our communities and our students and staff. That is my input.
Thank you, Teresa.
You're welcome. It's very comprehensive. I'm not done.
Would anyone like to go next?
No.
Who'd like to go next?
I will. I agree with Teresa. I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm naive right now to say that I feel much more confident going into this budget season than I have in years past. Sorry, I know I'm jinxing us. But I feel like we're in a good place and I'm really excited about some of the progress and growth that we've seen in our program as a direct result of some of the little tweaks that we've made at a fairly fiscally responsible level. I would like to see a level services budget as well. Understanding that we have some significant capital costs coming at us and that now is a time to save what we can. I would also like to, for the benefit of our community, see a budget that accounts for program growth that you would recommend. Continued program growth.
How do you do that with level services?
No, those are two separate budgets.
Might be able to offset by reducing some program areas to fund the bigger ones. We'll always look at that.
And
I think for this budget, I would like to see more, what's the right word? A different layout, and we talk about it, something that is easier for, the non-finance people to understand and easily address, the growth, where the key growth areas are. And I know that right now, Pam, you have like the pie chart and all that stuff, but I do think that budget package where it's all the numbers at different columns, that if we were to kind of lay it out differently to highlight some of the key things, I do think it's also going to help to address a lot of the questions. I would like to see, and I know we talk about this, but the current system is not possible, is to tie the budget and also the program plan a little bit better with the FTEs, because FTEs are our biggest expense. To see, and I know that we have a different FTE growth total, but like it would be helpful to see, different areas of FTE, how it grows, how does it tie with our program. I would like to have this budget to be the first year with the multi-year, more detailed financial plan. And that would tie with our capital multi-year plan. And I do think that's going to help us to manage our budget going forward in the research.
Jake?
So I think the most important thing to me is the bigger picture context here. We know we're going to be asking the towns for Essex Elementary. We know that at some point we are going to need to ask the towns for a correction for our operational. This is not the year to do that. Mainly because we haven't talked with the towns about this at all. And nobody's prepared to think about that yet. So I want to do what we need to do to avoid triggering call it a correction. It often takes the form of an operational override, but I think we need to Anna's point, think about that multi-year plan about when we are going to ask for Essex Elementary funding, when we in the capital context, if and when we might need to ask for something there, if we don't have enough set aside. And when we are likely, particularly if we do agree to slow down the reserve use, when we are going to potentially trigger or ask for a correction. And if we do that, we should do that in the context of a long-term plan. So that's not just for this year's budget or that year's budget, but that it gets us a few years into the future as well. And that's going to take planning. So I think the worst thing we could do this year is to put forward a budget that is going to cause the towns to ask for an override that will only get us through next year and make additional later requests harder, that much harder. So I agree with Teresa. I'm looking forward to the joint FinCom meeting to see what their thoughts are on what they can handle. I think that'll give us a good sense of kind of the scope that we're working within. And if we need to use reserves this year, I think, we've got a reasonable reserve. I know the issues of using it, but I think it's more important to use it than to trigger the kind of override requests that will do more harm in the longer term than just getting this year's budget funded. And so that may mean we have to prioritize. And, I think, and I agree with everybody, put everything on the table, so to speak, so that we know what's there and what you think you can do. But ultimately, we're going to be, at least in my experience, the past couple of years, we're going to be in that same conversation of where are our priorities and how do we make programmatic decisions kind of to meet a budget. Sure.
I went through your bullets in order, so I'd like to see a budget that has no cost to programming, that has efficiency savings wherever possible. I definitely think that we saw the benefit last year from listening to our principals and incorporating things, and I really do think it's in some ways even more important in light of some of the very significant expenses that we're going to be looking at with Essex Elementary School. And we also make sure we're prioritizing the programming that many of our residents are looking for, and that people don't feel like we are trying to, that there's things that we should be doing that we're avoiding because we're looking at funding Essex Elementary School. I actually think that would not set us up for the success we want. So I do want to really understand what the principals are looking for and think they need to continue to offer the excellent education we've offered. I think it's important to fund stabilization in some measured and systematic way, and I think that should be built into the budget if we're not going to do policy. So I'd be in favor of putting a line item for that. In terms of non-media salaries, and it sounds like we probably have an approach to that. I think the most important thing is that we don't have, I know in the past it's seemed like there might be some non-media professionals who could be outpaced by media professionals in a way that would not be effective to their roles. I don't think we want that to be happening, so that's where I'd be most concerned about it, but open to your input. Reserves, I think like Jake, I'm comfortable using them. I actually, in some perverse way, look forward to when we start spending the stabilization, because I think in some ways, like you, I was in favor of using our reserves for the fields, because I think when we use our reserves, people understand more why we're accumulating them. I think when we're not using them, they become this abstract thing that looks like we're trying to create like some slush fund here or something, and that's clearly not the intent. But so I'm comfortable using them, and I think as we start to use them more consistently with stabilization, it will become clear that we need to not use them so much through E&T, because we're not going to put ourselves in a difficult position. In terms of the budget narrative, I think it's important to figure out a way to concisely describe why we have a declining enrollment and rising costs. We all know the answer to this. We've talked about it ad nauseum. It will again be part of the conversation, and the more we can articulate why that is, because we've looked at it. Here's a few key drivers. We know what they are, but the more concise and just understandable that explanation can be, is going to go a long way, because it's a very understandable question. I get what people ask it, so we should be prepared to address it head on, I think. That's it. Sorry.
Sure.
This might be too much. But I would like to see, because I feel like the past few years, the budget, the first round of budget to the last round of budget, the major swing is the healthcare percentage. I would like to see, if possible, that we aim for low, a low percentage based on the previous, years. And then if it does come in higher, we use the reserve to fund, like the difference. And that way, if we are not changing the entire budget, I feel like the entire budget is on the chopping block, and it depends on the healthcare rate, the health insurance rate. So if we can manage that rate, more accurately, and more effectively, I do think it's going to help with the budget process.
Is the health insurance growth like our natural growth and that it compounds year over year? Such that if we don't account for it in our operating budget.
No, I'm not saying that we don't account for it, but like, I think in the beginning, last June, we account for, I think, 16%, 12%, and it ended up to be like, what, 5, 6? Yes.
7.
So, and are you saying make a more conservative assumption at the
Yes.
start?
But you also said that then we would fund it out of reserves.
If it end up to be 8, and we assume 7.
Do we want to get into some of this? We can share what we got as the initial, we've gotten 2 numbers from them. Or do you want to go first? And then we can get into,
Yeah. It's gonna get
Yeah,
That's gonna be here for you first, before we go down this rabbit hole.
so in general, when it comes to the narrative, I do think that as the important part for me with a budget narrative is that all of us as a committee, agrees and sort of has one voice as much as we can when discussing the budget, right? I think that's very important from that perspective. When it comes to, how you present the budget to us and what we'd like to see, it's very important for me to understand what additions we think are important for the growth of our, and I don't want to say, program necessarily, program, but the continued improvement of our program. Right? And that can mean a few different things. So I want to make sure we keep an open mind about that. From my time and just what I know in general, there's always going to be budget constraints in one way or another. That's just a simple reality. So, we simply look at the budget from that lens, then, that's very narrow focused. And I think that does a disservice to our students and our community at large, right? So want to make sure that we're approaching it from that lens, that we have, different options to then make our decisions on. And those are related to it.
so maybe a couple of clarifying questions. Go ahead.
Is it all right with you? I just wanted to make a comment based on what Anna was saying about the conservative versus not with the healthcare numbers, because this comes up frequently. I wonder if that might not be a really good opportunity for collaboration with our town partners, though, because that is a specific circumstance where if we estimate low, but it comes in higher because we know that with the schedule, we don't get those numbers till late breaking, it is going to be a direct hit to them. Would they prefer we do that, or would they prefer that we
What would it be a direct hit?
is going to increase our, but if we find out late in the game that the budget is going to go up because of that, I'm not suggesting that we just automatically take it from reserves. I'm saying for the budgeting purposes, I think that would be valuable to ask them which they prefer.
So we can start with this, maybe this clarifying question. So the tentative budget, I sent you that little write-up that we have, is typically the draft budget and has always been, it's a norm, it's not written, that it's the high water mark. So it's the highest our budget proposal will ever be in the course of discussion, which is why we have usually carried the number we're being quoted for healthcare at that point in time. Last year was double typical. And we're starting this year with, it came in initial, what was that, about 18%? And they came back last week with 21%.
Going in the wrong direction.
We have some tools, we can go out to bid, we can look at changing providers. We know some of it's stemming from our utilization in the types of cases that we have. So what we get for an introductory rate, I think we need to plan for 2 years. Long story short, I totally understand what Anna's saying. We start high and we end up bringing it low. But the theory behind that is because we want to set the high water mark about if we didn't have reserves, we're relying on assessments, this is what the budget would look like with this number, what they didn't have. So I think it's what, 800,000 over what last year's number would be just out of the gate without anything else considered.
The thing I want us to be thinking about, so last year when this happened, our joint FinCom said to us, okay, but if that number goes down, we want to see that savings flow directly back to us, which I understand. But the issue that I want to try and tackle is there were things that we wanted to do that we might have done with that budgetary resource, but by setting it up at the high water mark, we lost the opportunity to kind of take advantage of what ultimately was a savings, not exactly a savings, but to plan for what we really thought should have been in our budget. And that's like, there's just a tension there where I guess I want to know. It doesn't make sense. It's hard to set a number that's considerably below what we're being quoted. But I'd like to know what we're giving up, if it weren't for how high the quote was, what's the thing that you might have thought we should do that we can't pursue because the quote is as high as it is?
Or
I see what you're
something.
saying.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not even the quote that's preventing us. It's the annual market growth for healthcare. Healthcare will always typically comes in twice what our growth allowance is. So every year we're starting a deficit on healthcare out of the gate and needing to make up from other parts of the budget. So this is really just above and beyond. So I would be looking at the extra being, if, maybe in a conservative, what did you say? Usually comes down to about a third. Roughly. That would still be double what it was last year. So knowing a little bit of it, if it's tricky and it's not about not wanting to dream, but it's about knowing you're starting in deficit every year. So we're already $500,000 in the hole because we're using reserves for that. Healthcare will be, if we're lucky, twice. This year, if we're really lucky, three times what it was last year. So our level services isn't affordable by the town. So I don't think we're ever really not adding something because of healthcare. What we're doing is looking for other things to shift around within the level services box to sunset a program here so that we can add an instructional specialist here. Where that's healthy, I think, is it forces us not to hold on to things for too long. Sometimes we do hold on to things a little longer than we should, but it gives us a push to try to move things, modernize things, and shift resources around. So typically, I think the way, if I could draw the diagram, I just keep if we're going to level service, that means same number of staff, doesn't mean it's the same type of staff. So how do you move that chessboard around to deal with what principals are asking for or articulating as a need or to program or deal with prevention? And then we're trying to figure out healthcare in other ways. If we're going to take on healthcare on our own, if it sustains at such a high number, I don't know how you get away without looking at that.
So can we do, and I think I'm hearing your question, but first I just want to say, I think we have to be careful about using the framing savings when we're talking about budgets. Because there was nothing there to begin with, right? It's a draft budget, so we don't save anything, we're just putting a new budget out there. So with that in mind, and I think I heard your original question is our norm has been not to go above the first draft for benefit of town planning. Am I hearing that correctly? Mm-hmm. And maybe what I'm hearing Erica ask is, are there different assumptions we can make in that first one that still allows us to honor that we won't go above it, but doesn't limit what we include just because we made a budget about healthcare? So, if you were to do the conservative and a suggestion of a conservative healthcare budget of a third less or quarter less or whatever it may be that you feel comfortable with, that we can make assumptions about program costs or other costs, you know, in other lines that may still result in a higher first draft. But then where we know it's on the table, so to speak.
I know we're trying to stay away from percentage growth. Is there a number that's too high for the first budget?
I think I think all numbers are going to feel too high to our town partners. I mean, there's healthcare alone is going to be nuts. But I think there's real value in us understanding what the actual cost is without any use of reserves as an operating source, and so that we can move from there. And so,
So exclude reserves from tentative budget.
I'm suggesting that we have that for visibility. I'm not suggesting that that be the presentation and the first high watermark. I'm suggesting that we have that for visibility so that we know with levels, however you end up presenting this, managing all of our inputs and questions, what the actual cost really would be.
So in principle, I think in principle, it makes good sense process-wise to put everything on the table. The number will be what the number will be. That said, because there is a town implication for even the first budget, I do think we need to be conscious of the town situation. And at the moment, I have no idea what that is. I'm hoping to hear about it at the joint meeting. So I think we need to be sensitive to that. You know, this is still the first budget though, so it can't be constrained by that in the first budget.
You can have different versions in the first round even. Here's the baseline, just, no, business as usual versus like, everything on the table. And then so people can have a comparison.
Sure.
Even in the first round.
I do think it worked well last year, though, that we started from kind of a certain point. We knew that there was that, we knew what the principals were asking. We knew that we were sort of starting from an assumption of we're not trying to cut here. That we don't want to make cuts. And then as savings from the healthcare came in, we as a committee had to balance the ask from the towns with the asks of the principals and make some concessions there on both sides, which in the end, nobody was entirely happy about, but felt that we could at least come to a majority support on.
Yeah, we achieved, probably worth going back and noting, and we can bring out the document. Staffing was all achieved by reorganization of other staff.
Right.
So there was very little from the healthcare adjustment that went into addition to expansions. I think about 60,000. Everything else was a shuffle.
Nice.
Did everyone provide, I know that
We're comfortable with in excess of a 10% increase shown on the budget.
I'm not comfortable with it at all, but I think if that's what the reality is, to see what it looks like to start off with a look at here's what level services cost with the absurd healthcare increase and no use of reserves, then we're going to have to build in from there. I mean, our towns are not going to go for that.
So
I don't know.
I'll be online on Thursday, but would anybody feel comfortable addressing this and giving fair warning to our FinCom members so they're not getting, if we, the committee has been, I'll take it, the district has a history of being told not to do this. So we just want to all make sure we're not to bring in an inflated and exaggerated tentative budget that has absolutely no chance of being realized. So as long as we are articulating the FinCom exercise that you're going through and why you're asking for it, I think it's important. Because it could be a headline grabber and the story of why you're doing this could get away from us quickly.
So I'm getting this right. Are you putting it together to be the baseline? Or are you actually adding on the thing that's nice to have?
That's where she's asking us for guidance on.
I mean,
At this point,
just
ten
removal of
percent
reserves
isn't
and
really
say,
nice to have.
Hmm?
10% isn't really nice to have.
But it's not about
It's
the.
just healthcare and not using reserves. That's what 10%
I'm gonna
is.
do hand now, so you.
The reason why we're here is that we've been, like, for 5 years, artificially deflating our budget by using reserves and other factors and shuffling and finding efficiencies. We've been doing that for really 8 years, you know. So, you know, the long-term planning was in place for us to ask for a correction of this previous year before. That didn't happen, so now we're still further behind. We did the long-term planning. But go ahead, Teresa.
No, I'm hearing what you're saying and I'm also, it's occurring to me. I think it's really important also that our town partners not here. It's the timing of the budget cycle. Like at the next meeting, we're going to get the first view of the budget. I'm not going to support a 10% increase. I guess that's part of my ask on a planned graduated reduction in use of reserves. So whatever that looks like, that seems reasonable to financialize, and maybe the finance subcommittee helps with that as well. That can be built into this as well, but it's important that we have full viewing of this, because like you said, we've been doing this for some years now. We are in a hole. I don't think
Yeah,
we can,
how
it's not
much has
fair
it
to them to
compounded?
pull it out right now. But we need to know what it truly is.
And I can only assume that the baseline from our town partners is going to be the same that it's been for the past decade,
Right.
which is do your best to keep costs under 2.5%. And that hasn't changed.
No, we have,
That's an initial position, so.
haven't they? Was it last year for Essex, 3%, 2.5 was the request.
So if we just assume the 2.21% healthcare, the removal of reserves, you're at 1.3 to 1.4 million before accounting for, other things are looking typical, like 3 to 4 range for salaries, 3.5 to 4 range for special education tuitions. So things will move around, everything else around 3.5 to 4. So
Did we get a consensus from everybody on the 2.5 increases for non-union staff? Did we get a clear consensus to get in direction?
I heard tackle it, and if we can do targeted resets, that's better. So we're gonna not come out with some blanket. We're gonna try to take a look at those who have not had the benefit of a market reset through reorganization. So it could be a pool that then gets distributed. We can do this. It's just, I think we need to give fair warning as to what exercise we're going through, and not that we're coming out asking for pie in the sky and running up in excess of a 10% budget increase.
I feel like that might be useful in coming, certainly if someone's going to be there and wants to speak to it, but it might be also valuable to have you send an actual email to them that they can distribute to their committees in advance of that meeting, so that they don't come in with.
That's the like is to be clear, like your point makes total sense, that this isn't designed to be inflammatory, and everybody all work that. But I'd like it to be understood also that there is no way that any committee should do a budget process without fully understanding all the drivers. That is the only sound way to do budget. I mean, I don't know, that was a long time ago, but I think it's the only sound way to do budgeting, which doesn't mean we're doing pie in the sky. It's actually not pie in the sky, as Chris said. It's not pie in the sky, but we have to see it all before we can figure out how to trim it back. But sure, we should let them know that. And it's also what I'd like to differentiate, because it's not intended to be inflammatory. It's also not intended, it's not a strategy where we show a really high number just so we can reduce it. It's actually so we can think logically about if we're going to have how to reduce, if we have to reduce this, where, what things can we agree on? That's the conversation we need to have. So I don't know how in the past we've done it without having the full number, because it seems like it's a really important starting point. That said, the high school has awards nights at the exact same time. So I have 2 listeners. I will be on the call as soon as they're, but I will not be able to make that statement.
So clear as mud then?
Okay.
Do you want to, so I think, does anyone need to understand some other high level numbers that they've asked so far, just to be frame up?
I do have one more question, and it didn't include it.
Sure.
I didn't put it on the bullet list, but should we be working with the assumption that we're going to try to expand school choice by another 20 heads? Last year, we had talked about gradually bringing it up to 100. We're at about 80 right now. I kind of looked at it. Feels like we're at 79 right.
Targeted in the middle and high school.
I would go back and take another look. And just to make sure, right, we
We
did
did
have,
have a couple very
we have a
small.
couple of custody classes where it could be beneficial. I'm anticipating we may have a classroom request or two.
Do you have data about, you don't know in advance where siblings are? If we were doing targeted grades,
No, but we take them as kind of the first,
right?
first, yeah. So we can open it up and then the thought could be we just take the siblings. We're gonna have to look at a couple of. We're going early, it'll get posted right after Thanksgiving break. We're gonna do it early like we did last year, so we have the numbers.
Spring month.
Hmm?
Spring month.
So we'll see where we'll see if we can get 20 in comfortably, and we'll see where it could help us at some spots in the elementary school where we're. The second grade is, seems like I can sign a lot of enrollment forms, and they're in second grade.
So, about school choice, I think you mentioned before that you think the enrollment is gonna flatten. So the school choice, the 20 seats you're talking about, even if it's flat, you still have 20 seats. Potentially, without additional increase from any other expenses.
That's what I'm gonna go look at. With my target of 20 heads. Where would I put, where could we put it?
Without increasing our teams.
Because what I'm thinking about, it might be controversial if I say it out loud. So random school choice, 80% of the right in school, 20% they are in elementary, very, very little, only 10 out of, I don't know, 80, 70 something. So the 3A just passed, but we have additional 4 or 5 students per year based on the study. For younger families, supposedly, we will go into elementary. So for elementary, when there is no additional seats already, because most of the school choice are in high school, for them to transition out when there are more students coming in, that will be the additional cost. So if we were to add on the 20, it depends on where you put the 20 seats.
Yeah, that's what I think that she's saying that she will only put them in classes where in grade levels. Where
There's
won't have
excess.
that test.
I don't think we have that
Even with a buffer.
time before the impact of 3A starts to be felt. And that's not gonna be next year or the year after.
Right, but once the school choice are in, they are in the system wherever.
True.
Till they graduate.
I guess I'm envisioning that they're, they're moving out of the elementary school by the time your 3A families would begin, but I guess we don't know that the 3A families are gonna have elementary versus middle or high.
And the 20 Cs is, on the revenue side is 100. So,
There's something else to consider as well. So when it comes to,
You're saying
if there's,
Directionally, yes, continue to plan for school choice and start to look for where we can.
if there's additional housing, that also has an impact on Prop 2.5, right? That means additional town funding as well. So
We've been as big
based
as
on how Prop 2.5 works, right?
1585 and carried as many as 150 school choice students, so we've got some work.
Michelle,
Bottleneck, I'm sorry, I didn't catch up.
what's the additional, you said the insurance rate is gonna be double. What's that translating to dollar amount? Increase, I mean.
Yeah, for the 21%, we're looking at 800,000.
So if we were to do 1/3 in more conservatively, we're talking about 600K.
Yeah, the vice.
So you're talking about even the baseline, 500, 600K, just on the health insurance, plus the 500K from the reserve.
I think it's 800 over where we would match. Because it's like from 7 to 21, it's 8, okay, 7% to 21%. It's a huge.
All right.
Started optimistic. I mean, it typically we find a way through, so we'll continue to work it and see if we can get out there and get a better deal.
It's only 8 o'clock. No.
This is helpful.
So next then is the continued business, and we can, I guess, two topics on our agenda for continued business is board development, and then also subcommittee charge development.
I was under the impression that we had accepted 3 goals.
So we can take that off the agenda then.
Yeah, but we have one more, the superintendent.
We agree, we basically came to the conclusion that that's practice rather than goal. We need to do it no matter what.
That's true.
Right. So I think we can take that off the continued business. The goal itself. Goal, yes.
Blast out it. Do you have them?
I was gonna ask you if you could all send me what we landed on
I
for
gotta,
goals so I could post them.
I gotta go back.
And then
in
I'll
time.
blast them out to you.
There's a motion.
Yeah, if you have, because everyone was working on it, I think it's in, if you have your final, just send it to me, I'll put it all on one sheet. I would like to post them.
Yeah.
And if you can't find them, just let me know and we'll go through minutes.
All right, so
Community charges.
subcommittee charges, yeah, so this is, would remind me again, because I didn't have time today to go through this and where we stood.
The charges?
Yeah.
Do you want to, so sometimes school committees will come up with a formal description of what each subcommittee is charged with doing and how they are to operate. So is the committee interested in putting together some small explainers? So the group to know what they're working on.
And I found what I think is the last version we had of this, which was in 2022, 23. And so they were structured, for example, finance, that had an objective, the 2023, 24 budget, finance correction with member towns, then it had like 3 bullets about kind of what the tasks were. And we did that for each of the subcommittees.
I think I would ask the question that Anthony's, what problem are we trying to solve? That's really cool. I don't know, we're gonna spend a lot of time developing these
Right.
bullets. Does it get us, does it advance at all?
I think the problem, I'm not sure we need to solve it right now. But I think one problem that we're trying to solve with that is that there's a difference between like the list of things we need to accomplish for the year at the subcommittee level, which I think is maybe what you're referring to, that we've kind of done each year. Versus what I understood this to be, which was a more, not a policy statement, not like that, but a explanation of the purpose of that subcommittee and what kinds of things they're supposed to do and their focus in that way. Because when we have people come on to the committee new, there's a transition period there of understanding what it is when a subcommittee changes and that sort of thing. It gives people a direction on that. I'm not sure that right now is the time we need to solve that issue. But
Really, we're only talking
that's what I'm
about
looking for.
the finance committee and the policy subcommittee. The other 2 committees are,
What shall we negotiate next?
I don't think we need anything. It's really just, in my opinion, finance and policy.
So the existing thing that we have, unless it is majorly wrong, maybe we probably shouldn't
just assume that people carry
Yeah.
forward.
Or, I mean, if that's something that maybe over the course of the years, the two of you work together in that frame of mind also, that might be something that you could come up with, a more robust statement of what be done, and we could look at that in spring.
And that's where I would push the group a little bit and say it actually should work in reverse. The committee should set the scope of work and the charge for the subcommittee. And I'm not trying to be difficult. And then it's what you should live by regardless if it's, we're all here, or if it's 10 years from now and it's all new people, you can always vote to change it. But so when you don't have somebody who's been on the committee before, somebody who's been here, tell the history, somebody can pick up a piece of paper and say, okay, I got signed, this is what we do, what I'm supposed to do.
So
But we don't have anything to start from.
Yeah. Because otherwise it will always take on the thing we might be interested in doing or create differences of opinion among people on the group. So it's just fine. Alright.
I feel like there will be some charges that are the same year to year. And then there will be some that are specific to the goals that the school committee has set. If I'm looking at our goals right now, and my inclination is to divvy up our goals amongst the subcommittees appropriately according to the goals that we've set, so that we have a plan for executing them.
So I'll just say, this has come up for me and having just got on the finance subcommittee. This has come up for me because I have always assumed from how people reported out that the finance committee included considerations of budget and planning and working with the towns, to think about that planning and the implications of that. Obviously, part of that is tracking yearly finance. But that is not what I was told when I got on. So I just want to be clear, the charge should be clear about that role, right? So I've even heard tonight that maybe the finance committee should take on that kind of planning of what it looks like, using reserves or not, or assumptions impact on reserves. That's a multi-year budget planning kind of conversation. So that makes sense to me. But I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about that.
I think what I understand that's with you. As the task comes, and then the committee having a discussion, and with some people assign that say that's running subcommittee to this and that.
My experience on the finance subcommittee was so varied over the different iterations of the committee, that if we had that charge to live by, it probably would have been really helpful and simplified things a lot. But it was wildly different each year.
They have taken on different forms. So I would say the history of subcommittees was as needed. They weren't standing, we didn't have standing meetings with regular sessions. It was, oh, somebody's proposing policy,
Right.
or we got something from the department or from MASC, let's convene and work on it for policy. For finance, it was the chair and the vice chair. They attended collaboration. And that was about it. That's about it. Anna has an interest in kind of the accounting and technical aspects of budgeting. So we're kind of going down that road right now and kind of fashioning it after the Triton meeting. Subcommittee that meets regularly to look at vouchers and treasurer's reports and that type of thing. And that's common. But Jake has a question about whether or not we could take up more of the planning pieces. It really doesn't matter to Michelle, or I just don't feel like you want to put me and Michelle in the position of having to broker the deal every time somebody on a subcommittee has an idea about what the subcommittee could be. Right. In future, people won't be they'll be in different positions. It's going to be very hard for somebody to say no. So it does just, I think there's value. It doesn't have to be done tonight at 8:15, but there might be some value in what do you want your standing committees to hold as recurring responsibilities, and then your committee, if something comes out of left field, can always assign the appropriate group to take it on. Yeah.
I think that's a great starting point. And also sounds like it's definitely not something to consider tonight, but we did, so.
I'm happy to shop around to see if we have, do a little research and see if we can get, if Triton has something in writing, if Masco has something in writing, other regional school committees for some of their stuff,
Okay, great.
as a jumping off point of what some of the common tasks for those groups are.
Yeah, it's something for us to review. Versus trying to create something.
And please don't take it, I'm not trying to narrow the scope, it would just be helpful if everyone had a clear, common understanding.
All right, so unless there's any other questions about that, moving forward to school committee comment.
I just sent an email that I think has the 3 goals that we landed on, that everybody should now have in their inbox. So if you think that that is not a goal that we landed on, please. Oh. Sorry, guys. Please let me know.
This isn't so much a comment as a question that I meant to ask in the budget. What are you seeing about utilities at this point?
Last year we had a significant decrease. This year we have a slight uptick, but not much.
I'm hearing about massive increases in the news for Eversource and different things. So I'm just wondering
Yeah,
if
we had locked
we
most
locked
of our
in.
rates.
So good. All right. Thank you.
I think what we're saying was, if it weren't for the healthcare thing, we're in pretty good position and things were looking very good, manageable opportunity to, do what we do usually to get to what the wants are. So it's just kind of hanging out there, and then some of the federal funding questions, etc. Some people are more heightened than others. I just don't think anybody knows how to judge. That's all I got.
Okay,
So I just want to say, at our last meeting, I had the conversation with Allison via Zoom about students with disabilities and MCAS, and kind of left it in an awkward place. I just wanted to follow up and say, I met with Allison and Pam about that, and she helped me understand how my thinking was off. And part of that is the definition of what counts as students with disability for the purposes of MCAS, right, which is only students who have IEPs, right? And even my years at the state, I didn't fully grasp the implications of that. So she helped me understand that. And I think one of the things that really was a positive outcome or part of that conversation, but I think has implications for our future work, is starting to think about, all right, if that then can't show growth for that student population, what could, right? And what could we look at that we can say, hey, we have actually made progress with those students if our MCAS and accountability system can't do that.
Well, right, that's a fluid population, so I would say graduating out.
So that's the kind of conversation that we started,
having your
right?
Disability remediated such that you no longer require that. And for some students, that is a reasonable expectation, and for some it's not.
Yeah, and she even started to think about, all right, can I look at their MCAS scores, knowing that they were formerly in that category, what are their scores now, right? So there's different ways we could look at it, but all I'm saying is that it sparked that conversation, which I think may be very productive for us, that we can look beyond just the standard kind of MCAS reporting,
Well,
to talk a little bit more holistically about our students.
that's interesting in relation to our goal about defining and measuring academic excellence.
Right.
I think we'll invite her, try to get her on schedule the new year to kind of show you some of the data that she had been pulling. And we started looking at it with the AP question because it just wasn't sitting right with me that we had only one student who took an AP test. So we went and looked at kids who had formerly been on IEPs, and we had at least 13 kids. Their scores were comparable, if not better than gen ed, long-term gen ed kids. And she found the same to be true with kids who had exited IEPs, and their performance on MCAS in many cases is better than the total average population. So there is some really good news in there. And she has a nice way of being able to break it down to show it to people. So we're looking at a little bit of an abbreviated STEP review for probably February. That was a good conversation.
It was very productive.
That-
I hope we get a chance to do that as a group here.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor? Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us online.